beautiful ethic cuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse. Welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think changing our workplace can change our world, I got a real treat for you today. I'm coming at you live and direct from San Francisco for the Compliance in the Age of AI conference, which I'll be speaking at in a little bit. You know, everybody's been talking about it, and by everybody, of course, I mean me. So I'm here for that. Let's dive in with a couple of announcements. As always, your network is your net worth. You got to drop that LinkedIn URL in the chat and connect with at least one person today. We have such a unique asset in this marketplace. You know, we had a talk on Tuesday in the Tuesday session with Mel, and we were talking about mentorship. And our entire market is full of mentors and mentees, and you get no bonus points for reinventing the wheel. So drop that LinkedIn URL in the chat. If you're a privacy person and you're nervous about people finding your LinkedIn URL, just tell us where you're coming from. We're today going to be talking about from audit to action, turning findings into value with the one and only Heather Wood. So let's give her a massive emoji explosion as I run through these announcements. Check out the Ethico Library. If you're not, at least throughout the week, listening to podcasts, listening to audiobooks, listening to the ethics experts, you're leaving a lot of impact on the table. You have to feed your brain. You have to, those inputs, whatever you let into the brain, ultimately determine the outcomes that we're all striving for. So hit this QR code and see what's out there. We, of course, at our booth today at the AI conference, we're going to be giving out a bunch of books, and we're going to be giving away some books today as well. The world famous Ethicsverse book giveaway is in live effect, like it is on every single episode. We're still pushing the book, The Art of Ideation by Hema and Ashley. I can't say enough great things about this book. So if you have not picked that up yet, go to Amazon and get it. Or don't be shy, drop some great questions and comments in the chat. I want to share a phenomenal clip from my podcast with Ken real briefly here, Ken Myers. I've had literally hundreds of conversations with people in this space, and nobody said it that way.
You know, those regulations, those things, people lose sight of the fact that just because they can't control it doesn't mean that there's no benefit of those regulations. So regulations typically are intended to defend or support or protect consumers. And you might not agree with all of it, but at its core, it's what the consumer ultimately wants. And so if you disregard or downplay that group of sort of compliance, you're missing out on what your customer actually wants. So from a business perspective, you're not looking at the holistic view of what your customer wants. And so if you then think of like compliance as a function now, compliance is not just some policing activity. Now compliance is a mechanism of making the business more appealing to the customer. It is a customer-centric idea. This is how you connect upper level management to this idea that actually we're here to support the business and the customer. We're not here to be a police.
How smart is that? I mean, I've done 200 plus episodes. I never heard that angle before. So if you have not listened to the Ethics Experts Top 2% Global Podcast, okay, this is not going to be a waste of your time. Definitely check that out. We have great thought leaders on literally every single week that you can pull something from when you're walking your dog or when your kids are being a little bit too loud. Like I said, I'm at the AI conference right now. So if you're in San Francisco, here's your last chance to shoot over. You know what? I'll just sneak in at this point. Okay. So if you're in town and you haven't bought a ticket, swing on by and check out some of these great sessions that are coming out. Speaking of great sessions, this session, the Promised Land promotion is ending this month. Thank you, all of you who have engaged with this promotion. You know, a lot of people are in tools that are really old. A lot of people are in tools where they can't get the support. Look, listen, no vendor is going to like change your, your entire lot in life. But when you have a vendor who can be a true extension of your team and that is investing in their tool set, in their platform, it can allow you to make a much bigger impact and spend more of your time not doing jobs by hand, but rather putting your unique skills to work that you were hired for, right? So the Promised Land promotion is going through the end of the month. Look at all these awards Ethico just won. Phenomenal. I just couldn't be more proud of this. I framed this now in my son's room. I just want him to realize all the progress that we're making at Ethico. Momentum leader, grid leader, high performer, easiest to do business with, which I love. So if you still you just want to see kind of what's out there, sign up for a no pitch zone demo and we'll show you what's available. Our risk, we featured our risk assessment tool last week. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback about that. And we're going to be talking some more about how to leverage real-time risk assessments on particular risk areas to get a quicker feedback loop on what might be going on in the organization. And this is particularly valuable with AI crashing across our shores. But I want to just share this little video on our disclosure report. This can cut out so much time for you with these flexible disclosure campaigns, so you can get a good handle on the conflicts of interest or whatever other disclosures you have within your organization, and save yourself some time.
The auditors just called. They want to see last year's disclosure records, but they're scattered across emails, spreadsheets, and shared drives. Half the forms are missing and the rest are inconsistent.
Transform your disclosure management with Ethico. Templated forms for COIs, GIFs, and incidents with branching logic and easy configurability. Every disclosure tracked, time-stamped, and securely stored. Easily drill down and filter by status, location, disclosure type, and more. Automated sends and reminders ensure nothing falls through the cracks. Real-time comparative dashboards reveal patterns and emerging risks. Ethico disclosure forms. Manage, mitigate, resolve. Talk to your client success manager to learn more.
Okay, so you got 18 days left. If you want to get in on this promotion, all you got to do is book a demo. And so check it out. All right, so with that, let's give a warm Ethicsverse welcome to Heather Wood. Heather, how's it going?
Good. Happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of y'all.
All right, so we're going to be talking about today kind of moving beyond identifying deficiencies and using audits to drive real transformation within the organization. So you got two CPAs on the call here today, so get your pencils out, get out your green bar paper, and maybe take some notes on that. So we're going to be talking about some techniques to break down some of these silos and be more proactive and drive more effective risk management in the organization. So let's just dive right in, Heather. In your experience, you've worked in a lot of different industries. What do you see as some of the most overlooked early warning signs that compliance professionals should be monitoring?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little anecdotal here for a minute. So I pursued my CPA specifically because I remember attending my very first accounting class in undergrad. I don't know if y'all can see it, but I went to Florida State, so go Noles. And during that first class, they really shared the history of compliance and audit together. And in that, they talked about Al Capone and how he was finally arrested because he was caught from tax evasion. If no one knew that, it wasn't all of his gangster activities. It was really the fact that he didn't do his taxes correctly. He didn't file all of his gangster activity on his tax return. And so, I just thought that was pretty cool, at the time, and something I wanted to do one day. I think early in my career, probably most Big Four auditors can relate. I wanted to make a name for myself. I wanted to prove that I belonged at, this impressive firm right out of college, and, by finding fraud. I laugh thinking back to the naivety of my eagerness of that mentality back then. In reality, as many of y'all might know, only about 4% of fraud cases are actually identified by an external auditor. I knew I wanted to work in the compliance anti-fraud space, though. And so that's where I transitioned out of external audit and into internal audit in my career. With all that being said, I still have never identified fraud myself. But I've had a lot of exposure to investigations and controls work in trying to prevent it from ever occurring in the first place. What I've found is that many leaders ignore findings if there's no absolute proof. People generally do not like assumptions or living in the gray. I think only lawyers are probably comfortable working with ambiguity by the nature of their profession. But unfortunately, that is a detective and reactive mindset. And we need to have a shift towards being preventative and proactive with our risk management. The often, the meat of the question, the often overlooked warning signs that compliance professionals should be monitoring and asking their auditors to pay attention to are the subtle things. not the big ones that are glaring, because that's going to already have major oversight on it. It's the little things, the subtle shifts in employee behavior. Maybe it's someone who has closed up personally, what they tend to share on a personal level. Or maybe they're reluctant to share information about the process or what they do day to day, which you haven't experienced in the past. Or maybe it's documentation and communication that they're not willing to share. Or they've become unusually defensive during an audit.
What is that supposed to mean? Just kidding.
Just in general, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I know everything. If you're an auditor, you've experienced it. I think
Totally.
I liked the preview that you shared at the beginning of, we're not the police, but people naturally get defensive when auditors come into the room because they think we're just here to tell you what you're doing wrong. And that's not the case. And if you are that type of auditor, maybe take a step back and rethink your approach, because you're never going to have a collaborative relationship if that is how you step into the room. Almost you need to be a friend, but knowing that you still have to do your job. But it's there to start looking at being a partner versus the police.
Right.
And so from that, that reluctance, also paying attention to subtle shifts in culture. For example, low participation, whether it's employee resource groups or staff outings. I'm not saying that if you're busy, I have 2 children, I'm working on my master's, and I'm working full time. So there's events I also can't attend. But in general, low participation or lack of questions or overall just disengaged workforce is something that you want to kind of pay attention to. And that's why, again, I say it's subtle. It's not going to be a glaring mistake that you find on the financial statement a lot of times. It's these minor little red flags that are getting overlooked. Like I said, the very high risk critical items are, of course, the most important areas to address from a priority perspective. But I think groups tend to cut off your nose to spite your face type mentality when it comes to these low risk or immaterial areas. It's the area or the process or these remote locations that are immaterial, or, they're so small, they only have 5 employees, it doesn't matter, that never get touched or have hardly ever any oversight, that, if they know they're being ignored or they don't matter, quote unquote, that it can give those employees a false sense of security and opportunity for to put your organization at more risk. So, all of that being said, to answer your question, the early warning signs are the subtle things, really, culture, behavior.
And if we're only focusing on those massive items, to your point, those are really kind of lagging indicators, but there's always some kind of indication earlier on in that path that something is, off track. You know what I mean? You brought this point up. We want to be a friend. We of course have to do our job, but we don't want to be the police. There's a bunch of comments about that in the chat, and Frank made this point that he said, sometimes, when an audit is done, especially. Frank, by the way, drops fire in the chat every single week. But he said when the audit is done, especially an internal audit, people get very defensive because on some level, the audit grades their efforts. And most people don't take this feedback well. And so what strategies have you developed or found to be able to deliver that feedback or to keep that kind of an open door to gain access to some of those early warning signs? Because again, the ship is creaking, but sometimes we just don't hear it because we don't have the channels built, or we haven't activated the middle managers or whatever to get some of those early warning signs, or perhaps we're not looking at those employee engagement scores. Maybe those are only done once a quarter, or maybe once a year. So how do you kind of keep that door open, and how do you what are some tactics you've developed in order to, when you're delivering those kind of less than perfect scores on a particular process audit or whatever, How do you prevent that defensiveness that might kind of curtail some of that, future provision of risk intelligence that we need to do our job?
Yeah, I think first, you need to make sure as an auditor, not the recipient of an audit, but as an auditor, that you're truly driving value and addressing risks within the company. I've been part of plenty of audits where it was a check the box exercise, just because, to Frank's point, and hi Frank, thanks for calling it out. It's a valid point, and it's I've been on audit teams where the mentality is I'm the police and I'm here to make sure everything is tip top shape, but that's not always driving value. And why I say that is, are they getting at the policy says this and it's wrong, so cross, here's the finding, you need to fix it? Or is it, here's the root cause, here's an underlying issue that's going to help partner with the auditee or the supervisor of a function, that really it's training, it's a lack of training or effectiveness of training? Or is it they need funds to buy the right software or to help? Maybe they don't have the bandwidth, maybe they need more people on their team. You need to change your mindset of, hey, this is wrong, you need to fix it, and understand what is going to help drive value through the root cause, and work as a partner with the auditee to help so that they can leverage the audit report and maybe this bad finding to get what they need, and what they maybe have been asking for and not having the leverage to do so.
So it sounds like there's something on both sides, both like our mindset as the overseer, so to speak, and there also needs to be something around like how we frame it when we're delivering that report.
Absolutely.
Because, I think kind of assuming positive intent in general is probably a more effective way to go through life. And I think within an organization, if we can assume that positive intent or look for areas where a control just might not have been functioning appropriately, or the risk management apparatus that somebody's functioning within wasn't designed appropriately, those are probably going to be better things to focus on than just kind of coming in like, kicking the door down and saying, hey, fix this.
Yeah. So, I think you need to pose the question to yourself. Are you presenting findings just to have findings, or is there really truly a risk to this issue? I think audits should be risk-based. Some people would debate me on that, but if you want to drive value, that's where it's going to be at, is you see yourself as a risk management function.
Yeah, and I think getting back to that mindset piece, which we've been talking about a lot recently, getting back to that mindset piece, like our job is to add value to the organization. That value can come through the form of more excellence in the organization, right? Like a higher quality business has a higher degree of excellence in it, which the entailment of that statement is that there's better process adherence, the controls are working better, and so forth. But if we are just coming in, to your point, viewing ourselves as the hall monitors or whatever, as opposed to we're enabling the business and we're helping this engine run a lot more smoothly, I think you come with a different posture. How do we start to kind of overcome this? I'll just call it the branding problem. Is it merely like a mindset in all of us as participants within these functions that needs to shift, or do you think we need to show up in a bit of a different way? And perhaps like remind folks like what our whole agenda is and what our true angle is, or maybe it's something else.
No, I think you hit a good point. I think it's risk management professionals as a whole should work together. That's the whole point of this conversation, right? Is collaboration. How can we collaborate in the different pillars of compliance, law? Maybe it's HR, internal audit, InfoSec. How can we, at the end of the day, our job is to help the company manage its risk. So how can we collaborate together to shift that mindset in the organization with that first line of defense? Second and third line need to pair up together as a collaborative effort to change that mind, that thought process. Because if one pillar is tackling it one way And the internal audit comes in and we're like, well, oh, we're friends. We're not here to tell you it's wrong. But really, they've already gotten maybe a bad experience from the compliance function, from an investigation, or vice versa. Yeah. They're going to be naturally defensive. They're going to not believe what you're going to say. They're like, no, we've been through this. And I've experienced it many times where the business doesn't understand the difference even between a compliance investigation versus an audit. Right. Or even internal controls testing, like ICFR or SOX work versus an internal audit on the operations side. So I think there is a level of clarification and communication that needs to happen within the organizations to truly define the different risk management pillars, but then also, level up how we work together, and come up with a strategy that tackles it as we're not the police. We want, to help train you to do the right thing.
This tension, though, is always going to kind of be there. Like some of my, you can see this in a lot of movies and shows where there's this tension between, internal affairs and the cops walking the beat. You can tell I watch old shows. I also saw it firsthand in like manufacturing, where quality control at the end of the manufacturing line, there was, in some companies, there was this tension between them and those who were, pulling the levers and like spitting out the widgets. In some companies, though, I saw firsthand how that quality control department, so to speak, really worked in tandem with the manufacturing team. Well, I mean, obviously they were part of the manufacturing team, but like the people on the actual production line. And there was they were able to do that because there was sort of an overarching thing that everybody was pointing to. This was at like a high, a plant that really kind of prided itself on high quality, low safety incidents. And so I just saw kind of diametrically opposed kind of tension or like interaction or collaboration between these two, sort of functions and teams in these different organizations. And I think when we can better frame ourselves as quality control or quality improvement or business excellence, like we're trying to drive more business excellence, it kind of shifts the focus away from like pointing the finger at somebody else that can really drive a lot of that defensiveness that causes the walls to go up, that causes the flow of information or risk intelligence across the organization at scale. It causes that flow to go down. Pardon me. Great question here from Juan Garcia. Juan.
Focus on resiliency.
Go ahead, please. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, sorry. No, I think, for the collaboration between the different pillars, the mindset needs to be resiliency.
Yeah.
How are we making the organization resilient? I mean, that should be the foundation of risk management.
Yeah. Our audits are not trying to find a witch to burn at the stake. We're trying to improve the resiliency of the business so that it can be a going concern for, infinity. So exactly. Juan just asked, this is a great question. Thank you for sharing this one. Keep those questions coming if you want to book, gang. Okay. Juan said, from an auditee perspective, do you have any guidance on how to react to audit findings that are not necessarily based on policy, but instead based on good practice or best practice?
Yeah.
Sometimes some of those audit findings, they're not true violations or technical violations in the sense that somebody stepped outside of the line of a policy, but rather the findings are in pursuit of some kind of, best practice. Like how would you deliver that in a different way? And what advice do you have for an auditee to kind of navigate through that?
I think this is a great question. So thank you, Juan, for submitting that. What I've seen in my career is, we don't put everything in the audit report. We will do, we really are shifting from 10, 15 page audit reports where each page is its kind of own finding with here's the management action plan, here's the due date, here's the owner, so on and so forth, and combining it to a one-page audit report. A one-page audit report seems drastic if you haven't seen one yet. If your company doesn't do that, it is something that I've seen commonly being transitioned in the audit field, though. And so you only are getting your high-risk critical findings on that one page, because again, it's from a risk perspective. So that's what matters. The perceived best practices or maybe not based on a policy violation, a lot of times that can be communicated. It doesn't need to be in the audit report. Now, again, if it's not on paper, how do you track it to remediation? There is a question there. I think it goes back to what type of relationship have you built with your auditees to make sure that you're not just giving findings, but you're also following up on remediation. And not just from a tracking perspective, not just saying, hey, what's the status on this, but being proactive partner. Again, you're going to hear me say that word a million times, but being a partner with the auditee to implement the recommendations that you're giving them. Because if you've worked together on that plan, maybe they still need some oversight as it's getting implemented to make sure that it's getting implemented correctly versus putting all this time in and then coming after the fact and it's still maybe not right or not really truly addressing the risk. But for these good practices, I would say communicate it, talk about it, maybe put it in a one-pager that goes to the auditee, but maybe not the senior leadership, not the board, not the CFO, or however your company structures your audit committee distribution list, but directly to the person who may be implementing, that better practice.
Yeah, I think for third lines that are primarily concerned about justifying their own existence, the audits that they put out, the reports that they put out, drive a lot more of that feeling of defensiveness. Because if I'm trying to justify my existence, then I must, in order to do that, in order to add value, I have to find all these, people that are doing things incorrectly. If our focus is shifted, not on ourselves, but rather on like adding value to the organization, which is kind of the through line and the theme of this discussion, that incorporating these things as best practices or incorporating these things as ideas for improvement over and above or in addition to technical policy violations kind of allows for a lot more of that collaboration. Jessica said this comment, or her answer to this question from Juan was, I think if we're using quote unquote best practice as observations, we have to determine if that's our goal, and if so, set real tangible pathways for obtaining it. The caution with this, however, becomes we are now creating new standards by which to be held from a regulatory perspective, creating internal policies built on best practices, et cetera. So it's not something easy. Second, third line, it gets increasingly hard to navigate through the complexities of a different organization or a different department and all these little kind of microcultures that exist within an organization. But I think some of those considerations are extremely actionable. You brought up remediation a couple of times in your last answer. And so when we're thinking about remediation, what kind of frameworks have you found that are most effective in prioritizing those remediation efforts, especially around, a limited resource set? Like nobody on this call has like just more, no one's swimming in resources like Scrooge McDuck was swimming in gold. You know what I'm saying? Like we all have limited resources. We all have a limited amount of time. Our auditees presumably are working hard as well. So how do you kind of prioritize those things? Is it simply limiting, going through the exercise of limiting it to a single page? Like what are some of those frameworks?
So we mostly use a risk ranking prioritization. We have a guideline of what makes a finding high risk, low risk, moderate risk. And that was built, those guidelines were built out with the business process owners. So they agree. And it really is through a risk assessment process of what they feel is detrimental. And then with our idea or our experience on the risk side as well, to where we have a standard guideline. I know risk ranking findings or risk ranking in the audit as a whole is also a debated topic because some companies, maybe just focus on the risk ranking and not the finding itself or the root cause. But that's the approach that we took. And so, we have this standard guideline of the ratings of the finding, and we prioritize that. So, high risk findings, or critical, depending on what your scale you're using, is the ones that really should try to, be focused and addressed first. Some examples would be ones that have systemic control failures or that cross multiple business units and functions, or have the potential for regulatory compliance fines or penalties. Those would be ones that would fall under like our high or critical rating, and we would want to make sure that we're putting the resources, if we have limited resources, funds, and people, we want to put it to those because that's, again, going to drive the highest risk or impact to the company downstream.
Yeah. Jessica made this point that Frank celebrated, so it must be a good point. She said, as auditors, we also have to be careful not to let perfect be the enemy of good. Celebrating audit passes helps to catalyze the team to better progress if that's what works. And so again, we have to get away from this mentality of, I can find something wrong. Like in any paper, any well-written paper, even if it's long enough, you're probably going to find some kind of an error. That doesn't mean that the whole paper is garbage. So I find it interesting that like in many of these risk management, functions, we don't even take like a risk-based approach to like the findings themselves. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like finding one thing wrong, like we don't bring, let me say it this way, like a lot of folks in internal audit came out of accounting. One of the main principles in accounting is materiality, right? And it's like, we need to bring that lens to everything we do because, perfect can't be the enemy of good, to Jessica's point. And we have to recognize that there's always going to be room for improvement. Like we can't fall into, I just think if the audit function is meant to drive, better business outcomes, then we need to have our like business person pantsuit or jackets on and keep in mind that like there's always going to be room for improvement. And, we need to like move, we need to move the needle. There's always going to be issues. There's always going to be dust in the plant, so to speak. How do you think people can better start to like embrace that kind of a mindset?
I think I think something that we did successfully was not just highlight findings that things were done wrong, but in our audit report, we also would include kudos for things that we found that were doing great.
There you go.
And, that was really well received. If you put that first in the audit report, then it reduces the potential defensiveness going on because it's like, hey, I did this really great. And your boss sees that. And the auditors noted it as well. And then, I think the mindset, I don't know, I'm kind of at a loss for words here.
Well, I just, just to kind of tag on to what you're saying, like what, it kind of goes back to what we were saying before, like, why do we exist? If our worth is only finding a bunch of like, bad things that are going on, well, then the odds of us showing up like a business person are going to be, lower on the priority list. And that sort of materiality, I think, is going to be, even kind of below that. If we're showing up to say like, okay, well, like from a risk-based perspective or from, through my materiality lens, yes, there's a couple of, dust mites in the corner, but pretty much this massive room is clean. I think it allows us to really integrate with the business a lot more because like, I think this whole police thing, it kind of implies that there's this, that we're on different teams. And if we're part of the organization, by our nature, we're all wearing the same jersey. We want the same, we're all looking at the same side of the scoreboard, hoping that those points go up. Yeah. And I think it's an opportunity for us, back to your original point, if we want to have those canaries in the coal mine, or we want to have access to some of those early indicators, then we have to pave, we have to like wear a pathway through this forest that we're navigating through, and show up as a reasonable participant, as part of the team, and reinforce that we're not against you. I'm not working against you. I'm working for, like you are, I'm working for the goals of the organization. And I think there's just a constant opportunity to come to these kinds of engagements with that kind of a posture. And also part of our job is to provide insight to leadership. And when we're really trying to solve for our own egos or our own sort of self-protection, I think that causes us to make a 20-page audit report and say, look how smart I am, look at all this stuff I checked. And like the leader that might be reading that report, they don't have all the context necessarily. They're looking at that report itself. And sometimes we can reinforce, this bad brand of like the sky is falling, this sort of panicky Pete energy. I hate a panicky Pete. So I think showing up with that kind of a posture just allows for a lot more goodness and a much clearer picture from leadership who's not doing the freaking audit themselves. Is this car off the road or is it just kind of near the edge of the lane marker? You know what I mean?
I think it ties back again to what is the risk? Is there a risk? Because if there is, that's our job and that's our intent. And that's going to help keep the company resilient is by pushing on those areas. But if there's not, we don't need perfection. We're all humans. And I think as auditors, there's this old mentality that, again, we're the police or that we're robots and that we need to be perfect. And that's not the case. I think if we take a step back and, we're human, the auditees are human, there's going to be errors, and that's okay. But that's where you evaluate how bad is the error, and that's where you risk rank it of, okay, this is something we need to tackle. But if it's just a fat fingering or something like that, then, it happens.
Yeah. Here's a great comment from Scott. He said the phrase best practice, I promise I won't say this too much, Scott, I know you hate it. The phrase best practice is like nail on a chalkboard to me. A recommendation needs to be set in a particular context of the applicable regulations and the specific organization and the way and what they are trying to achieve. From a compliance perspective, calling something a quote unquote best practice sidesteps grounding that recommendation in what the achievement is sought. It often is a call to authority. Exactly. It's totally an appeal to authority instead of taking the time to identify what risk a practice is creating. So, I mean, I'd love to hear your response to that because, but don't say best practice, okay? Because nails on a chalkboard. But that lack of context in many times, again, reinforces this thing of like, oh, that's just an auditor. They're not like a business person.
Yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with best practices. Sorry, I said the word already. Obviously, I am a bit of a perfectionist. I color code my books, as you can see.
Yeah,
I'm a little
it's
bit
really nice.
Striving for A+ work, but again, kind of that theme I just mentioned of being human and taking a step back and realizing, do you need A+ work?
Right.
C's get degrees, and I'm not saying we're all just shooting for C's. There's a level of compliance, good work, great work, and best practice, best work. What really resonates or is needed by your company and the workload that you do or the industry that you're in? Are you highly regulated where you can only do A+ work and if not, you're setting your company up for major risk? Are you, in healthcare and dealing with HIPAA and, PII type information that you can't not do A+ work when it's coming to your patient's information, or again, on the banking side, that's heavily regulated. But are you somewhere in between? So I think you have to gauge you need to know your company, your industry, and what is okay. What is the strategy of your executive leadership? What is their risk appetite? Because sometimes, risk can be a good thing. It has two sides. It's a two-faced coin. There's opportunity, which is the other side. And sometimes a C or a B level work is what's needed to innovate or to keep going. And you need to understand to have errors and be comfortable in that in between and not just always shoot for an A+, but knowing when you need to have that A+. Yeah,
and I would challenge those of us who are also recovering perfectionists to really try to diagnose or see where that striving for perfectionism is not actually serving you. Because to your point, mastery in any field is like knowing what matters and what doesn't matter. And it's a very sort of basic approach to say, well, then every single step needs to be perfect. And it's like, unless you're in a hermetically sealed, manufacturing environment, well, then maybe not everything needs to be, absolutely perfect. And to your point, innovation, there's that famous saying of, move fast and break stuff. Well, those are errors. Those are unintended consequences that that in that kind of environment or under that kind of a motto, you're willing to tolerate some kind of volatility in the system in pursuit of something that is more important, to your point. And so if we're quote unquote good business people who are adding to the scoreboard, and if we're part of the team, we must understand what plays the organization is running. And if that's unclear, then you need to you need to have some conversations to pull that clarity into your own mind and better understand what are these strategic objectives of the organization. What does leadership absolutely care about? And I think when we're talking about leadership, I want to kind of dive into this next question about what techniques have you found in presenting work or presenting your work. Hello, can I even read today? I'm sorry. What techniques have you seen work best for presenting findings to senior leadership that drive action instead of defensiveness? Because I think sometimes a leader can say, like, I think everything's going pretty well, and then they get this new bunch of data that can really skew that. And I think that can sometimes drive some defensiveness at the executive level. So how do you kind of navigate through that? Is it merely changing findings to words like observation? Is it just sort of tactical, sort of semantic things like that? Listen, semantics matter for sure, but how do you sort of maintain the right frame around the quote unquote findings or observations so that you avoid that unnecessary defensiveness?
I think it all stems and goes back to having great communication. Don't let senior leadership find out about a high-risk finding through the issuance of an audit report. If you're doing that, you are failing. That's not a C. If you're trying to build this rapport and this relationship and prevent defensiveness and you're letting that happen, that's where you need to focus, restructuring your communication and your schedule before issuing an audit report. During the audit, once you have enough evidence to confirm your conclusion of an issue, discuss your understanding of the finding with that stakeholder to double check, because you also never want to go to a senior leader and say this is a problem and you haven't vetted all of the checks. And so, discuss it with your team, or depending on what level you are in the audit organization or the function, discuss it with your manager or discuss it with your chief audit executive, and game plan, or strategize how and who should know and when. Because there's different levels and different personalities that you may be working with, and it could be perceived or received differently depending on who it's communicated to. Maybe the CFO is very much a stickler and needs to know everything before the CEO, or maybe the VP before the CFO. However that dynamic works in your company, that's where, at the end of the day, being an auditor is all about relationships. It's knowing your people, knowing your company, knowing who you're auditing, because everyone receives communication differently. And so you need to start to build that rapport with them to know what's going to be best received. But do not let an audit report be a surprise. So have audit management, again, that CAE, whoever that game plan determination is, to notify senior leadership. Maybe it's via a one-on-one status update. If the CAE meets with the CFO once a week or once a month, timely, obviously, you can't just hold up your audit report before this communication. So maybe it needs to be a scheduled meeting, but go through that route. Maybe it is an email, maybe it's a phone call, maybe it's an office drop by. Just whichever approach resonates most with that applicable senior leader. Make sure that they're aware. that the issue has been identified. It will be a high risk finding on the audit report. It is coming, but really this allows the senior leader to save face and have a game plan of their own on how they would like to craft that message to their supervisors. Because at the end of the day, that is why people don't like audit reports. They're afraid of what their boss is going to say, or that it's going to hurt their bonus or their performance rating, which at the end of the day, it's not about that, and it shouldn't be. It's about the risk of the company and how can we all work together to improve that.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And, I'm one of the world's most mediocre home chefs, home cooks. And I love that show, Top Chef. And sometimes you see like one of the contestants get absolutely roasted when the judges are like, "Did you even taste this first?" And I think, the ones who always seem to win are always the ones who you can see them tasting their food or having somebody else taste it. And I think if we're not doing that, if we're just sort of going off and we're just, documenting everything without that context and without that sort of back and forth along the way, then we really run the risk of, saying the sky is falling, clutching pearls unnecessarily, or looking like an idiot that reinforces this bad brand that we have where we're apart from the business as, this third line function instead of a part of the business that's really helping to drive that improvement. And so having conversations like you said, before that final report is issued to get a sense of like, hey, am I totally off base here? Like, is this a tolerable risk? If from your viewpoint is going to give you some better data and some better, information, I guess, about the existence of this thing that's, maybe a little bit outside the lines. There's a good question here from Michael. Michael, thanks for sharing this. He said, one of the challenges I have had is that technically there's a violation, minor or otherwise. Realistically, the violation is still minor or really doesn't stick in our own company / industry, even if the regs identify it as a quote unquote shall. So how much subjectivity or judgment are we allowed as auditors without jeopardizing our role in the company? What a phenomenal question.
Wow. You could answer this a million different ways. I think, again, it depends.
We'll pick one or two.
I think it depends on the industry. I've mostly in my career been in manufacturing. I'm now part of the rail industry, which is heavily regulated. It's really probably my first real regulated industry I've been a part of. And so that approach, I think, would vary differently because of that. I think this is where that collaboration and relationship with maybe your legal function comes into play. Because, you said without jeopardizing the company, where can you be lenient? And maybe that's not totally an auditor's judgment. Maybe it's a group decision or group evaluation. And so I think, if the regulation is a shall do this or, that comes into legal risk management. And so you might be auditing it, but that's where you need to have conversations with your legal team before you go into it. And before maybe, especially if there's a regulatory impact or might need privilege over the audit, that you have those conversations before you get into it. That way, maybe what can and cannot be in writing. That way you're not putting yourself even more at risk for your company. And so I think it's, again, a collaborative relationship in that sense with your law team of how or where a violation of that nature should or should not be documented in an audit report or elsewhere.
Yeah, it's like having those kind of conversations or indicating the extent to which you applied some subjectivity or the reason or the framework that drove the finding or drove the recommendation can, again, give some more context to the reader of that report to understand, like, okay, this is not necessarily something that's over the line, or maybe this is something that is technically at play, but doesn't really apply to our sort of sub-niche within this industry. I think really provides a lot more clarity to leadership and allows for a lot less kind of occurrence of error types, you know what I mean? Of, misunderstandings that could, drive some efforts or drive some panic that is that's unnecessary. So we spend a lot of time talking about the need for relationships and the need to sort of rebrand in some ways and interact with the workforce or with our counterparts, our auditees, in a sort of more collaborative way. So what strategies have you found in breaking down these sort of natural silos that can seem to kind of erect between compliance and legal and business units during that remediation phase? So we found something, we have to remediate. How do we break these kind of silos down and make sure that people realize that we're all rowing in the same direction?
Well, I would preface with, do not wait until the remediation phase to start breaking the silo between compliance, audit, and legal. And I'll repeat that over and over and over. Auditors, lawyers, compliance professionals, we should all be collaborating from the very beginning. Even at the start of developing the annual audit plan, or if your company does a rolling 12 plan, whatever approach your company takes, legal and ethics and compliance should be in those discussions. And I'm not saying that it needs to be at their direction. It should be collaborative with them. Hey, this is what we're seeing. Is there anything that you're seeing that we should be aware of as well as one of the pillars of risk management for the company? And that should also include IT governance or the InfoSec pillar. It should be, again, collaborative between the main risk management pillars to ensure the company has a connected risk framework, strategy, and management approach. Auditors are never going to have a good working relationship with lawyers if they are doing their audits with potential for high-risk findings in a complete silo regarding legal risk management perspective or regulatory compliance. You don't want to find yourself or your company in a position where you find something that should be removed from scope and put it under privilege or into an investigation. And then that kind of goes back to what I said earlier, the difference between investigation and audit. And find yourself that you or your staff aren't knowledgeable of how to identify that situation or how to communicate it. Sometimes it's easier to have audits under client attorney privilege from the get-go than trying to navigate how to get coverage halfway through. Share your audit plans with compliance and legal. Discuss if any, may want to be at the direction of counsel. Foster those relationships from the beginning. If you're already going to be on site, say for a standard operations audit, manufacturing, being in a plant in a foreign country, there's different regulations that you might need to be aware of, even some of the questions you're allowed to ask. It saves compliance from making a similar trip. You can coordinate what potential monitoring or control effectiveness tests you could scope in to assist them. And again, that builds that relationship instead of being in a silo. It saves the company money because only one team has to go instead of two. Another option would be to utilize a guest auditor program with these groups so that you have their professional insights right there with you as you're doing your audit. They can bring their own strengths and expertise to the evaluation of controls and processes, or even during the scoping and planning of the audit to ensure that, a better collaboration or transition when it gets to the end.
Yeah, I think that's such smart advice, like employing that fair process and previewing what the plan is and being open to some input on how you might better achieve that plan with people that are in those actual functions. I think not only can probably save you a lot of time in running down a path that's not going to be material or running down a path that's not going to really uncover anything, but also make them feel like they're part of the process in that the audit itself is not just one extra thing that's being imposed on them, but it's something that has the right context around like what goals are meant to achieve. And I think as we're stepping into this age of AI, there's a lot of anxiety in our space because, the question is, to what extent are our jobs going to be obsolete? And so I just would constantly be looking for ways to like display and provide value to the organization that are not like AI-able. And that's going to be building those relationships. That's going to be making sure that, because like AI in many cases lacks context. It lacks the idiosyncratic context that comes along with the unique characteristics of a particular business and the people that are involved and the power dynamics that are in play. And I think if we can bring more, we can spend more of our time ensuring that whatever plan we put out or whatever audit activities we end up doing are influenced and colored by those realities for the specific situation that we're auditing. I think it preserves our, it gives us a lot more sort of like job security, for lack of a better term, but it also then provides a lot more opportunity to show up in a different way, to be that business person, to make sure that our limited resources, our limited application of our time are done in the most sort of effective, the most effective way. Chauncey had a great comment here. Thanks for this, Chauncey. All organizations' processes fall across the spectrum of perfect, optimal, and opportunities, and they are constantly shifting. And an operations appetite of where they are most comfortable existing often indicates how they see our compliance efforts. Where they have optimal processes, they often see our value because they feel supporting our compliance efforts. Where there are many opportunities in the operation, they may be resistant to our efforts. So the first hurdle is convincing them our work has a benefit to the business. I mean, that's a bullseye to me. Let's get a round of applause for that. That was like so spot on. But getting that feedback loop and, eliminating, we all function on some layer of assumptions, right? Like not everything that we assume has necessarily been explicitly stated as being important. And I think understanding where the company or where a department exists on that spectrum that Chauncey just referenced can give us some good hints at what strategies we might need to employ in getting their participation and building that relationship and framing out what role we are playing in that submission, so to speak, that that department is playing in pursuit of the broader sort of organizational mission.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about tracking the progress and effectiveness of post-audit remediation efforts, what metrics have you found most valuable? What KPIs are you keying in on to get sort of more security in the fact that progress is being made?
I think a key metric all auditors and compliance professionals should be paying attention to is the trend on repeat findings. And I don't just mean the same finding for the same audit type at the same location year over year that maybe didn't get remediated, but the same finding or similar root cause across business units or entities or global locations. I think this is an important factor that should be tracked because it could be a red flag that you have a systemic issue, not just a problem site or a problem, operating effectiveness at one location. And so that maybe the previous remediation efforts were not effective. So don't just look at your issues in a vacuum. Pay attention to them holistically. How are the findings happening from location to location or business unit to business unit or entity, depending on how your company is structured? I think most auditors jump to the completion rate and average time to remediate KPIs. And while obviously efficiency and completeness are always important, I feel quality over quantity is, an important factor. Who cares if you closed out a finding in 1 month if the action plan was really only to put a Band-Aid on the problem instead of, truly addressing the root cause to truly stop the bleeding, which might have taken longer. So, these metrics don't speak to whether the action plan you're giving management are truly value creating or effective. And that's why, I think you really should focus on these repeat findings because that would add to your criticality and potential root cause.
Yeah, and also your credibility in focusing folks on the things that matter most. Patricia had this great comment that kind of sums up this entire discussion, I think. She said, when I have conversations, I really avoid setting up an us versus them dynamic. I refer to the company as the thing I'm representing, directly put to senior leadership. She would say, the biggest risk our organization is facing is blank. We're on the same side of protecting our organization. And so I think breaking down that kind of a dynamic, breaking down those silos, really integrating with the team, showing up like a business person and making it easy for our adversary, which is going to be the reader of the report in this scenario, to take the actions that are going to be most meaningful in terms of de-risking the organization and improving this ultimately improving the business quality. I think can do a lot to help get this unstuck. So we are right at time. Let's get one more round of applause. Let's get one more emoji explosion for Heather. This was a phenomenal session. How we do? Almost 5,000 emojis. That's pretty good. So
wow.
Appreciate you all for coming today. Thanks for the lively chat. As always, we will be back next week for another phenomenal episode. I will be back in the studio. And love you all. See you soon.